Settle down.
As the sun set over Korea on June 24, 1950, all was quiet along the 38th parallel. With the exception of a few frontline soldiers assigned to night watch, most South Koreans had taken shelter for the night. July 24th had proven to be another typical, uneventful summer day in Korea. Even though there had been a buildup of soldiers on both sides of the DMZ, few South Koreans thought that full-scale war was imminent. Ever since Korea was divided at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, small skirmishes had broken out frequently around the DMZ. However, since neither side wanted to be considered the aggressor, there was little chance of escalation. At 0400, the night quiet was shattered by the roar of artillery shells as North Korean tanks and infantry surged across the 38th parallel. The invasion force, which consisted of 90,000 soldiers supported by 150 T-34 Soviet tanks, carried out an assault that spanned from coast to coast. First, Communist forces quickly overran Republic of Korea soldiers stationed on the Onjin Peninsula, the parallel's westernmost point. From there, they met little resistance until they reached South Korea's main line of defense 5 miles to the south. Meanwhile, the North Koreans concentrated 4 divisions on the Wijeonbu and Kaesong corridors. These ancient invasion routes had been used for centuries, and both led directly to Seoul. Defending these pivotal routes were 2 undermanned and badly armed Republic of Korea divisions. Within a few hours, the Korean People's Army was in control of both corridors. From there, they moved relatively unopposed toward the South Korean capital. When Kim Il-sung ordered his forces to invade on June 25, 1950, the ROK's army consisted of 95,000 soldiers who were trained by the U.S. Korean Military Advisory Group. Fearing that Syngman Rhee would use his army to invade North Korea, the KMAG had structured a force incapable of succeeding in heavy combat. At the beginning of the Korean War, the ROK Army had no tanks, no heavy artillery, and few anti-tank weapons. The largest guns in their arsenal were 90 105mm howitzer that had been used by the U.S. Army in World War II. The ROK command was also hindered by poor communication. When North Koreans came streaming across the 38th parallel, it took several hours for the ROK command to realize this was not just another border fight. To make matters worse, over half of the ROK soldiers were on leave at the time. In spite of these disadvantages, South Korean soldiers fought bravely and managed to slow down the KPA's advance in some places. However, a South Korean blunder on June 27th almost cost them the war. As Communist forces approached Seoul, ROK Army engineers blew up the Han River Highway Bridge prematurely, stranding thousands of South Korean soldiers and their equipment. Later that day, Seoul fell. Kim Il-sung had taken both the South Korean and United States governments by complete surprise. When the 4-year communist revolutionary movement in South Korea began to falter, Kim Il-sung turned to more overt means of unifying the peninsula under the Red Banner. In March 1949, he visited the Soviet Union and signed an arms pact in which Russia promised to expand the North Korean armed forces. While in Moscow, Kim pressed Stalin to support a North Korean invasion of the South. Stalin would not agree. He did not want any action that might provoke the USA into a war. Throughout 1949, Kim lobbied Stalin to back military action. By September 1949, Stalin began to consider the merits of military action. Stalin did so for 4 reasons. First, the victory of the Chinese Communists in the Chinese Civil War increased the strength of the Communist bloc in Asia. Second, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb in September, eliminating a major handicap in a war with the USA. Third, the establishment of NATO and worsening relations with the West reduced the prospects of attaining Stalin's foreign policy goals through diplomacy.
In fact, he opened up the blockade in 1949, that basically with NATO, Europe was coming to a passé, so maybe Joe Stalin was jumping over into Asia and was ordering this to be done as a new place to open a new front.
Or the reason could have been simpler.
Fourth one is, Kim Il-sung did it on his own. That's probably, many people think still is possible. The problem is Kim Il-sung, whatever it is, as far as we know, has taken it to his grave. He died in 1994. His son is currently the head of North Korea, but has succeeded him, but we really do not know, really and honestly, there is no documentation to say exactly why he did what he did.
Kim secretly visited the Soviet Union in April 1950. There, Stalin finally agreed to a North Korean invasion of South Korea. Kim boasted that his army would capture all of Korea in 2 to 3 weeks, long before American intervention would be possible. No matter what the reason may have been, the North Koreans were streaming across the 38th parallel, and the ROC Army seemed helpless to stop it. American military advisors stationed in Seoul began receiving reports of a communist attack at 0600 on June 25th. By 1000, they realized this was not a localized probe, but a full-scale invasion. As the day continued and more troubling reports continued to arrive from Korea, the world waited to see how Truman would respond.
When President Truman heard about it, he was home in his Independence, Missouri, when he first got word that this particular situation was going to take place in the middle of the morning. He was awakened with a phone call from Dean Acheson, his newest Secretary of State. And we see that the first thing Truman said was, well, we're going to make this a UN issue, and if we don't, then we'll worry about it. We'll take care of it.
That afternoon, Truman flew back to Washington and held a conference at the Blair House that night.
Truman took this very, very seriously when he came in, and he was determined as he flew back to Washington that when he got to the Blair House, Dean Acheson had come up with some ideas of what he was going to do, and Dean Acheson was determined that we have American citizens in South Korea, and we're going to use our Air Force to take care of them. We're going to protect those people. We're not going to let these people be hurt. So can we use the American Air Force? And Truman said yes.
Truman and Atkinson also turned to the highest-ranking American commander in the area of operation.
He also ordered MacArthur, who at that time was the man in charge of getting Japan being rehabilitated, that he could certainly use and give military support, not troops yet, but he could give military support in the way of weapons and whatnot to the South Koreans to help defend themselves. And he also decided that he was concerned that China might attack Taiwan at this time. He put the fleet, American fleet, immediately in between Formosa and Formosa, at that time it was called that, in mainland China. And so there were a number of things. And again, he kept saying, we're going to make this a Security Council issue in the UN.
That same day, the American Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations, Ernest A. Gross, presented a resolution before the UN Security Council urging them to take action. After several hours of discussion, the UN passed a resolution calling for North Korea to cease its aggressive actions and for all member nations to assist in achieving this end. The only nation to vote against the resolution was Communist Yugoslavia. Russia's deputy ambassador was not present during the voting.
That's one of the biggest mysteries of all time. And that's one of the things that says if Joe Stalin knew about this, why didn't he tell Malik, which is his representative in the UN, to quit boycotting? Well, why were the Russians boycotting? It was because at that particular time, one of the seats in the Security Council was held by nationalist China. China was always, at the end of World War II, when the UN was created, the big five. China was it. But during the Civil War, now nationalist China was on an island and mainland China wasn't even represented. And the United States would not allow this to happen. We were determined to not put a communist country in with the Soviet Union at that particular time as one of the big five. And so Malik was basically boycotting these UN Security Council meetings because of not allowing the Chinese, mainland Chinese, the Red Chinese representative to be there and still accepting the nationalist Chinese.
The Soviets would never let that happen again.
Immediately after that, Malik was told to go back in. And from that time on, voted against everything in the Security Council. And so anything dealing with Korea had to be moved into the General Assembly. And this certainly was an issue which allowed it to become a UN affair.
Soon after deciding to intervene in Korea, the United Nations placed General Douglas MacArthur in command of their military forces. The legendary American general had served with distinction in both World Wars and was commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific in World War II.
General MacArthur was, well, without a doubt, he was the man who was our leading expert in the Pacific. He had been in the Pacific since 1937. He had never even returned to the United States. He basically was stationed in the Philippines before World War II, vowed to return and liberate the Philippines, which he did. He was there signing the agreement ending World War II above the USS Missouri. He was asked to stay on in Japan and oversee Japan being rehabilitated into a democratic country. And he was a great soldier. Just as General Eisenhower was in the European theater, General Douglas A. MacArthur was in the Pacific.
While serving as the Supreme Commander of Allied occupation in Japan, MacArthur had been granted a certain degree of independence, as he was allowed to pass many reforms and oversee the creation of a new constitution. In Korea, however, he would have to take orders from a new commander.
In this particular conflict, and this conflict, he was going to be representing the UN and not necessarily the USA, though I'm not sure General MacArthur really understood that. I mean, he did, but at the same time, he still saw himself that his boss was the Commander-in-Chief of the United States, not necessarily the President of the United States, not necessarily working for the UN. General MacArthur was not a diplomat, he was a soldier, and that was it.
A troubling scene awaited MacArthur when he first assessed the situation in Korea. Of the 95,000 men that had originally made up the South Korean army, only 22,000 remained. Of these men, only 1 in 3 remained in possession of their personal weapons, and almost all heavy equipment had been lost. These heavy losses, however, barely managed to slow the communist advance. After flying over Korea on June 29th, General MacArthur determined that it would be necessary to commit American ground forces if they had any hope of saving South Korea. This was easier said than done.
At the time of the invasion of North Korea, when they crossed the 38th parallel, the division was under strength, obsolete equipment, and not very much training.
Since World War II ended in 1945, U.S. military spending had decreased dramatically.
Compared to what we had at the time in 1945, we had basically, our military went through a lot of downsizing. That's about the modern word that we would use. We were nowhere near the strength that we had in 1950 when this started.
When the Korean War started in June 1950, there were less than 600,000 Americans in active military service. In 1945, there were over 8 million. The Marine Corps, which had proven its worth during the Pacific Island campaigns in World War II, saw its numbers shrink from approximately 475,000 men to 75,000 in 1950. In fact, the Marine Corps almost ceased to exist after World War II. After Marines raised the American flag at Iwo Jima, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal proclaimed that the raising of that flag on Suribachi means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years. Despite Secretary Forrestal's prediction, the Corps faced an immediate institutional crisis following the war due to defense budget cuts. Army generals pushed to fold the Marine mission and assets into the other armed forces. However, congressional support enabled the Marines to rebuff such efforts, and in 1947, the National Security Act was passed, which resulted in statutory protection for the Corps. While this act saved the Marine Corps, it did not prevent military spending from being cut by $45 billion over 5 years. As a result, there was little technological advancement made between wars, and many of the weapons used when the Korean War began had also been used in World War II.
By the time we got to Korea, we were basically not as ready as we basically should have been at that particular time, and we had to therefore get our military back in shape. So it took a while to get us there, and certainly Fort Knox became a very active place again, a very active place during the beginnings of that particular time, in July and August of 1950.
While MacArthur scrambled to assemble an American fighting force in Korea, the KPA continued pressing south. Led by their T-34 tanks, the North Korean Army crossed the Han River and headed toward the Kum River, virtually unopposed. From there, the invasion force split into two main groups, with one sweeping across southwestern Korea, while the other headed southeast toward Pusan. As the remaining ROK soldiers continued to give up ground, it seemed only a matter of time before Kim Il-sung controlled all of Korea. The only thing that stood in his way was Task Force Smith. Named after Lieutenant Colonel Charles B. Smith, the task force had been hastily assembled from American forces in the area.
It was remarkable that they were able to gather those forces in the shape that they were in and put them together and get them over there. And by enough time with the 24th Division, see, they picked them up off the street and rushed them in there every way they could get them in there. And then they were pulling off. There were 4 other divisions there in Japan. They pulled those divisions out and stuck them in there, and then pulled a regiment off of Okinawa, and then were bringing divisions in from the States. And they got them in there pretty quickly.
Many officers under Smith's new command had combat experience. However, most of his 440 enlisted men did not. After arriving at Pusan Airport on July 1st, 1950, the soldiers of Task Force Smith immediately boarded trains and headed northwest.
It was just chaos. And then bringing them to Pusan, and then telling the unit, get as far north as you can, delay them as long as you can. And this is piecemeal commitment, which is contrary to massing and doing it right.
Colonel Smith and his men first encountered the North Korean Army at Pusan on July 5th. When the enemy T-34 tanks came within 4,000 yards of Task Force Smith's position, the American 105mm howitzers opened fire. Amidst a rain of shell fire, the undaunted Soviet-built tanks kept moving forward. At 700 yards, the American soldiers began firing their personal weapons, including 75mm recoilless rifles and bazookas, but nothing they had could stop the tanks' advance.
Against those tanks, they had that little 2.36 or 37 rocket launcher, and it just bounced off of those T-34 Russian tanks that the North Koreans were using. But they did get the newer one over within a month or two.
While Task Force Smith was distracted with the communist tanks, the North Korean infantry deployed and moved to flank them. With no hope of victory, Colonel Smith ordered his men to disengage. In America's first encounter with the North Koreans, they had suffered 150 casualties while inflicting little damage on the enemy. It was not a promising start to the UN's involvement in Korea, but reinforcements would soon arrive. On July 3, 1950, General William Dean and his 24th Division landed in Korea and immediately headed to the front. After engaging in several small skirmishes with the North Koreans, Dean's 24th Division decided to make a stand at Daejeon. For the first time in the war, UN forces had a weapon capable of damaging a T-34 tank, the 3.5-inch bazooka. With this new technology, U.S. soldiers did manage to destroy several tanks, but the end result remained the same.
The 24th Division almost got wiped out, the one that was committed first. And they were up around Daejeon's where they were getting it. And a colonel from Kentucky was the first, was a senior officer killed from Kentucky, and he was killed facing one of those tanks, fighting one of them. But, and General Dean was captured, the division commander, and got some criticism from some of the military for being where he was overly exposed and not where he could control what was going on. But it he ended up with the Congressional Medal of Honor for what he did.
Even though the 24th Division had failed to stop the North Korean invasion, they did manage to stall them long enough for other U.S. forces to arrive.
And 25th came in soon, and the 2nd Division, and with more time, the 1st Cav and the 3rd Division. So they were pushing those divisions in there and got in some divisions to fill in the vacancies. The 7th Division, they just stripped it. But all the equipment was old World War II stuff and poorly maintained, so that the trucks weren't in very good shape, the rifles weren't in very good shape, and they didn't have anything new since the war, since World War II. So, and the North Koreans were pretty well armed and well trained, and a lot of the officers had combat experiences against fighting with the communists in the Chinese Civil War. So they were really in a bind.
As July came to a close, the communists continued to push south and seemed destined to conquer all of Korea. With little hope of victory, the South Koreans needed help. They needed the Marines.